Hi, everybody. I'd love to introduce Madhu Khanna from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and she's been painting the large-scale picture of how the bioeconomy interacts with the wider macroeconomy, and the reality of agriculture on the ground. Welcome.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for inviting me to this to share my research. I'm going to talk about the challenge of understanding what the impacts of biofuel production in the U.S. or globally are, and from a scientific perspective. Just as a bit of background, biofuel production in the U.S., and we're talking primarily of ethanol which is being produced from corn, and biodiesel, which is being produced from soybean, has been growing exponentially over the last decade and a half. From virtually very small levels in 2005, we are now producing close to 16 billion gallons of corn ethanol, which is being blended in the gasoline that we consume, and in blends of about 10%. We're also producing a very large amount or converting about half of our soybeans into biodiesel, producing close to about 2 billion gallons of biodiesel, and blending that with petroleum diesel in blends of about 5 to 20%. And so and all of this has been supported by policy and by mandates, in a way of, for the purpose of reducing our dependence on imports, and also increasing our ability to produce renewable fuels that are expected to be lower carbon than gasoline, and therefore help with climate mitigation. However, as we've increased our production of biofuels, there have been a number of concerns that have risen pretty much from the get-go. And soon after we passed the renewable fuel standard in 2007, which mandated that we should be blending 36 billion gallons of biofuel by 2022, a mandate that we haven't quite achieved, far from achieving on many fronts. Was nevertheless accompanied soon after, in 2008, as you can see from this graph, with really a sharp increase in food crop prices, and so the line in blue is the global price, the global food index, and the line in red is the global fuel index, the oil price index, and as you can see, prior to 2007, 2008, the two were not really correlated. But after we started, increasing our production of corn ethanol, they became linked, and that was not too surprising, because because ethanol is a substitute for oil, or a complement, depending on how we think about it, and high oil prices led to increase in the price of corn in order to be able to produce ethanol with it, and so on. So the two became linked, and since then, that's been the case. There was another sharp price increase in 2012, 2013, and all of this sort of raised concerns for a couple of reasons. One is the economic reasons. As we try to divert more of our food crops from food to fuel, this has impacts on consumers, and we are a major exporter of corn and soybeans. So this has impacts globally on consumers worldwide, and implications for poverty reduction and so on. And then additionally, it also begins to lead to questions about the extent to which these biofuels are actually going to be leading to carbon savings. And part of that problem is because as food crop prices increase, it becomes more profitable to convert land to agriculture and to grow these crops and other crops. And as we convert natural land to agriculture, there is concern about it releasing carbon stocks in the soil, in the vegetation that is converted, and the concern that can lead to a large carbon debt that can take that is going to take a long time to be offset by the carbon savings that we get by displacing fossil fuels with U.S. biofuels.
Question.
Yes.
This competition is because you're using the food bits of the plant for fuel, but there's also like the corn is like mostly not food. So to what extent are the remnants of the of the corn and soy usable for biofuels?
Yes, and that's a great question. And in an ideal setting, with the goal is that we would begin to use the crop residues, that is the rest of the plant, the stalks that are currently just left in the field, and use that to produce biofuels. Those biofuels are what is referred to as cellulosic biofuels that are produced from biomass, like crop residues, forest residues. And was part of the Renewable Fuel Standard mandate. So out of the 36 billion gallons, 15 billion gallons was for corn ethanol, and 16 billion gallons was to be from cellulosic feedstocks like crop residues or other types of biomass crops that are not food crops. Unfortunately, the technology for producing those has not developed to commercial scale at a price point that is competitive, that is feasible. And so the production of those types of biofuels has really lagged. There continues to be a major research effort at universities like ours here and others, but it's still a work in progress.
Okay.
And so in the meantime, we've had mainly food crop-based biofuels.
And then the other one, why the release of carbon stocks? I mean, to me, it seems like you're still growing the same plants, and the agricultural production is as destructive or not destructive as with food production. What's the difference?
No, so the point here is that as these crop prices go up, land which would have been under forests or under native, grasses, long-term, permanently just non-cultivated, that sequesters a lot of carbon in the soil, in the grasses and the trees and so on. And when we clear that land in order to plant crops like corn and soybeans, we lose all the carbon that was stored over there. And that can be a large amount of carbon that can take a long time to re-sequester by growing corn and soybeans, because the way we currently grow corn and soybeans, we don't sequester a lot of carbon. And in fact, we may be depleting carbon because we till the soil so intensively that we are actually removing carbon from the soil rather than putting carbon in the soil.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. And so this is sort of just an example of the kinds of studies that people have done to show that cropland is expanding. The top map, the black dots represent the ethanol plants that were established largely in the Midwest, in the Corn Belt, and then the areas that are in blue are showing the areas where the arable, the non-crop land, which is arable, has been converted by 2012 relative to 2008. So it's sort of showing the percentage of arable non-crop land that was converted, and as you can see, areas around these within 100 kilometers of these ethanol plants are the ones where a lot of this change seems to be happening. And if we look at the bottom graph here, and I think I might have the wrong version of this thing, but anyway, this is a program that we have in the U.S. called the Conservation Reserve Program that has been there since the mid 1980s. It retires cropland from production in order to reduce nutrient runoff and other air and water quality impacts of agriculture, and puts it under permanent cover for 10 to 15 years in order to be able to provide some environmental ecosystem services. So this graph here shows the the trends in the land that has been enrolled, and in particular after 2007, you can see there's been a steady decline from about 35 million acres down to about 25 million acres. But 10 million acres have left the program. In part, that has been because of our legislation that has reduced the size of this program as it became more expensive. But it's also because of concerns that the reason it became so expensive and farmers chose to take their land out of this program is because it became more profitable to grow crops on that land rather than get the rental payments from the government for keeping the land enrolled in the CRP. So it's trends like this which kind of compound this concern that biofuels are the cause of land use change and maybe doing more harm than good in terms of its impacts on not only on carbon but also on other ecosystem services, so like nutrient loss reduction that is needed in order to deal with the hypoxia problem in the Gulf of Mexico and so on, that are all part of this problem of intensive agriculture production expanding. Now, of course, the challenge with just looking at information like this is that it doesn't tell you how much of this is because of other factors that might be happening at the same time, and how much of it is actually due to biofuels. And so, as I mentioned in the CRP case, this is a legislated program by the Farm Bill, and over the years, the Farm Bill has been lowering the cap for enrollment in this program, and that accounts also for part of this declining trend. And similarly with expansion, not all of the increase in food prices that I showed you on the previous slide can be attributed to just biofuels. There were many other factors, increasing demand from China, export restrictions in India, and so a number of other factors that were affecting food crop prices, lower inventories of grain and so on, that also fed into it and happened to be at the same time. But the question that we are interested in is how much of this cropland expansion was due to biofuels, and how do we determine that? And so just for the reasons that I mentioned, we know that crop prices can expand cropland and lead to conversion of forests and grasslands, not only in the US, but globally, because we are an open economy. We export a lot to the world market, and world prices go up when our exports go down. And this can cause a carbon debt. It can cause other ecosystem impacts that we care about. And so, now as we think about how biofuels might impact land use, there are a number of things that happen. We have, it's a market-based system. As we increase one demand on that existing system, it's going to do multiple things. And so, and that's what makes it a very complex issue to be able to really understand and to quantify, because there are multiple reactions that are set off. There could be an increase. So on the one hand, as demand increases, there's prices go up. There will be an increase in land that is brought into agriculture by expanding crop acreage. But there'll also be other things. There'll be a switch from lower value crops, for example, oats and barley, to higher value crops like corn and soybeans. There will be incentives to bring, some non-crop land, as well as to bring land which is, in this conservation reserve program, that as these contracts expire at the end of 10 years, landowners may want to come back into crop production. So these are sort of at the extensive margin, basically bringing other land into production. But there's also changes that are going to lead to more intensive management of the crop, so that we get more yield out of the same land, because now the yield is more valuable. And so that can lead to more, better crop varieties, more fertilizer application, efforts to increase yields. Changes in crop rotation. So we start growing 2 crops of soybean rather than 1 crop a year. We can reduce exports so that we have more domestically. We can also reduce our demand domestically, because as prices go up, it becomes more expensive to produce livestock. And so livestock products become more expensive, and demand falls as prices go up. And so that releases some additional amount of grain that can be used for biofuel. So there's many economic factors that occur, responses that occur, and teasing out all of those in order to understand, to what extent are we increasing supply, to what extent are we reducing demand, how are we going to meet this additional demand for corn and soybeans in order to meet these biofuels? What does the market do? And the market is going to essentially be doing things that are in the most profitable choices for each one of the sectors, and the economy is going to respond to this, and in a way that suits that's in their best interest. But figuring out the mix of these responses is complicated. So really the
one thing you're focusing on right now is food crops and agricultural processes. But are you going to focus also on say shifting from corn, soy to wild grasses, which can reside on the marginal land with deep roots, keeping the soil carbon there, or forest byproducts, which might come from standard logging, the branches and so on, are another potential source of biomass. Not sure if it's appropriate for biofuels.
Yeah. I mean, those are in the talk today. My focus is really on looking at our food crops, but looking at native grasses as a way to produce biofuels is something that people have looked at. There's a couple of issues related to that. Firstly is, of course, the technology to convert those grasses. It's the same issue as whether we convert native grasses or wild grown or cultivated biomass. The process of converting that into fuel is a major technological challenge. Mm-hmm. But in addition to that, the issue with using native grasses is twofold. One is that the yield of native grasses is typically rather low in terms of looking at the economics of harvesting and converting and transporting and all of that. The yields of these native grasses are it would require a large area in order to be able to feed a biorefinery. And mm-hmm. So the focus has been on what's called these dedicated energy crops, which are much more higher yielding. So from 1 acre of land, with a perennial energy crop like miscanthus or switchgrass, you can get 20 tons of biomass per hectare. If you're looking at native grasses, you might be able to get 2 tons of biomass per hectare. So you'd need 10 times as much land has to be harvested, and transportation is a big part of the cost of moving biomass. So
is that also
yeah, and then the other issue, just to complete that thought, the other issue is also people get concerned about biodiversity impacts of harvesting native wild grasses. So there's opposition to that as well. On the forest side,
but for the grasses and such, is the same analysis also true for like bamboo, which grows unusually fast for grasses, and or forests, which are at least way more vertical?
Yes, so there is not bamboo in particular, but people have looked at other short rotation crops like willow and poplar, and in like Australia, there's eucalyptus, and so there are studies and looking at that, and those are certainly good possibilities. They are limited geographically in which regions they can grow, but they're good options for those regions, and there is research looking at that. They'd be better than these food crops for a variety of reasons, and they can be grown on marginal land. And yes, those are good possibilities.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And I guess just a word on the forest side. We could have a whole presentation just looking at the challenges of using forest biomass, but forest residue seems to be what comes top of mind as something that people think is just being left in the forest and is a relatively a resource that you can divert without harming anything. But and there has been a lot of research looking into the possibility of using that, but the cost of collecting the residue can be significant, and the concerns about the forest residues also sequester carbon, and yes, they're going to decay over 15-20 years and release all that carbon, but they do hold carbon for the near term. People that are concerned about the fact that we need to be reducing carbon emissions immediately are concerned that by harvesting these residues and combusting them into fuel, we might go over the tipping point and so on. So Potentially, yes, forest residues are a source, and if we take a long-term perspective, then it makes sense to be using them rather than letting them decay and release carbon back to the atmosphere, which they're going to do anyway. So we could, in the meantime, use it to displace fossil fuels. But again, there's different schools of thought on that.
Right.
We can talk more about it.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And so, but I think the particular challenges with trying to understand the land use effects of these agricultural crops that are food crops is a little unique in the fact that these crops are being produced anyway for food production. And so trying to figure out what is the, additional carbon that is being either sequestered or released over and above what would have happened anyway is a difficult question, and it's difficult in the sense that it's not something that we can just use simple data to understand, and because what we really we want to do is we really want to compare the situation when we are producing these biofuels, the land use changes, configurations of all those choices that were made with biofuels and what they would have been if everything else had been the same, but we didn't have biofuels. So really, we're trying to do a comparison, with biofuels and without biofuels, keeping everything else the same. We don't want to do a comparison before biofuels and after biofuels. So we don't want to say, well, what was the situation in 2008 and what is the situation in 2023 and subtract the two and say this is all because of biofuels, because there's many things that could have changed and have changed over time. And so some of the graphs that I showed you in the beginning are doing that. They're looking at what happened in 2008 and they're looking at the land use in 2012 and subtracting one from the other and saying that, well, at least there's some association here, even if there isn't causation. And so, the scientific question is really how do we create a counterfactual that is not observed and be able to compare crop prices that would have been there before, with biofuels, without biofuels, land use, carbon stocks, and so on. And then develop this counterfactual in a way that actually can somehow be validated. It cannot really be directly observed. We don't really have a good way to say is this because the counterfactual is not observed. So we can't say is this true or not, but how can we say that at least it's valid? Constructing this counterfactual can be done in a couple of different ways. There is, econometric models that can be used, and they, of course, require historical data in order to be able to understand the relationship between corn ethanol and crop prices and crop acreage. And there's a number of issues because many of these things are simultaneously being determined. So how do you control for that simultaneity to be able to really tease out and isolate the effects of the particular variables that you're interested in on crop acreage? The other is to use simulation models, and simulation models can actually let you understand how the market equilibrium changes when you have multiple markets. So all of those effects that I described in the previous slide can actually be modeled, and we can tease out exactly how much exports would go down or how much crop prices went up and in which area, and taking into account all the co-products of corn ethanol and biodiesel and so on. So, so those are, depending on what the goal is, we can use different methods and try to understand. And of course, both can to some degree be validated to understand how good their predictions are. Sorry, I seem to have pulled up an earlier presentation, but in the interest of time, I'm going to just continue with this and fill in the gaps that I had done on my later presentation. So what I'm presenting is really results from, and I'll be happy to share the actual presentation. What I'm presenting is sort of results from two different studies that we did. The first is looking at this historical data in order to try to understand what people might consider to be something that is more evidence-based, because you can actually look at the observed land use and try to tease out from that what the effects of biofuel production is. And then the second is going to be the simulation-based modeling approach that tries to do a similar type of exercise, and then we can sort of see how the results of the two compare. And so for this first study, we used data from 2003 to 2014 on corn acreage and total crop acreage. And what we tried to do is to understand to what extent did crop acreage, corn acreage, and all crop acreage expand because in the proximity of these corn ethanol refineries, and while controlling for many other factors. And one of the other factors that we control for is crop price changes, because we know that corn acreage and crop acreages are going to be affected not only near the corn ethanol refineries, but they're going to be affected everywhere, because when crop prices go up, there's incentive to convert land to corn and crops across the country wherever it's feasible to do so. So we want to control for that. So we use this panel data approach and control for many other factors using county fixed effects. We control for spatial autocorrelation, endogeneity of crop prices and input prices and ethanol plant location and so on. So in order to isolate the effect of variables that we're particularly interested in. I think I'll just sort of skip over this, but it's based on this idea that farmers that are located close to an ethanol plant will have greater incentive to produce more corn because there's a nearer market for it and they don't have to transport it to a distant market. But they also have, when prices go up, everybody has an incentive, not just the ones near the corn ethanol refinery. So we want to control for those factors. Just want to show you the sort of regression equations if you're interested. And then this is just to give you an idea where the corn ethanol capacity is largely located. We use a particular method to calculate effective capacity, and our regression analysis really shows very consistent results across different specifications. The top two rows are really the most important ones for our current conversation, but they show that corn acreage does respond as expected to corn prices and to effective ethanol capacity. So, as ethanol refining goes up in a region or a location, corn acreage is going to go up. And similarly, as total cropland acreage also goes up in the same way as total food price index goes up. The top row here, acreage goes up, all crop acreage goes up. And similarly, as ethanol capacity goes up, all crop acreage also goes up. We sort of validate the model by looking at the deviations between predicted acreage over this period and observed acreage, and deviations are, less than 6% and smaller. So which suggests that our predictions are fairly reasonable. We look at maps of the spatial prediction of our model in terms of where there is observed acreage of total acreage, corn acreage predicted from our model in 2012, 2014, and we find that it seems to do a reasonably good job of predicting acreage. So from that we can calculate how elastic is crop acreage to crop prices, and what we find is that it's not very elastic. I mean, crop and acreage and corn acreage, it's relatively inelastic to crop prices, and it does change in response to ethanol capacity, but overall the responsiveness is relatively low. We can convert that into looking at so actually, if I could just take maybe a minute and maybe switch my presentation, and so let me.
Sure,
yeah, would that be okay? All right.
Oh, absolutely.
So let me. This is a challenge of having too many presentations versions out there.
As you're doing this, do you have data also on non-corn plants? Because it's one of your dynamics you're describing is conversion of non-corn to corn. So that would be something where if total is not increased, but corn increases at the expense of something else, that would highlight some of the dynamics.
Sorry, say it again.
Do you have data sets in like barley production, which is lower value, and to what extent transition?
Yes. Yeah. We look at 13 major crops, and we're looking at the extent to which the production of certain crops is going down and so on. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, let me put this one up. All right. So so this is sort of just to give you a little bit of an idea about the top graphs are showing this increase in corn ethanol after it begins to plateau out after about 2014ish. But the second panel shows these the crop prices, and those are, as you can see, they went up in 2008, 2012, and then they went down. And even the corn ethanol production has continued to increase and stabilize. These prices kind of went down later on. And crop acreage and corn acreage, it's fluctuated a little bit, but overall seems to be fairly at the aggregate level. It seems to be fairly steady. So so this is sort of what we try to do. And ultimately, at the end of this, what we find is that, to summarize here, that when you increase this ethanol capacity between 2008 and 2014, which is the third column over here, there was an increase of about 3% because of the ethanol in corn acreage, and sort of a 1% increase. The bottom panel shows the acreage increase because of ethanol at the national level. So 1% increase in acreage, because of corn ethanol capacity going up, in the vicinity of the corn plants, and really a 0.5% increase in acreage because of the change in crop prices that took place over this period, 2008 to 2014, due to keeping everything else the same. So it's there has been an increase. It's not as dramatic as many people claim it to be. The other thing is that prices has, as I showed you, went up and then came down. And when prices come down, land leaves agriculture. So if we actually look at overall the effects, then we can see that between 2008 and 2012, the areas in yellow show the increase and where it took place, and particularly around the corn ethanol refineries. But if you look at by 2014, a lot of that land went back to being idle, or some other went out of crop production because crop prices fell. And actually in 2014, in real terms, crop prices were as low as they had been in 2007. So it can be a transitory phenomena. And also over this time, corn yield increased dramatically. And so we could produce a larger amount of biofuel with less diversion of our land. And so it's a dynamic process and needs to be examined, how it changes over time. This just sort of shows, we calculate something called the amount of acres needed per billion gallons. And as you can see, based on the results of this study, that number came down over time. If we look over this entire period, that number was much smaller than it had been over a part of the earlier period. So that sort of shows the complexity, that it's not a static number. It's not something that is going to be constant over time. Both demand and supply change over time, and therefore it's something that needs to be calculated. Now, this was a reduced form approach. Yeah.
For the last slide, I didn't quite follow because your year periods were overlapping. So how do we read that?
Yeah, I mean, we did not actually, or haven't actually calculated. So the part of the challenge with this is that we have to use the entire data set, really from 2003 to 2014, to come up with these coefficients. And so it's hard to kind of really trace a dynamic path from year to year. We can do these calculations, but I think the only thing you could take away from this is that um, that if you look at the number between 2003 and 2012, it was higher than between 2003 and 2014. So there seems to be a downward trend, but it's, and the same thing at the bottom too. But this one is a little bit harder to trace, or at least I haven't done that here. So, but yeah.
And are there analyses that, I mean, this is already fairly old data, but are there analyses on the current generation of techniques and yields and so on?
Yeah. So we actually did a follow-up analysis extending this data to 2018 and found very similar results. And a part of the challenge that happens in being able to do long-term studies is that, that the definitions and consistency of the data itself changes, and that is what happened with this particular data set. So this is data set that comes from the National Agricultural Statistical Service, and in 2014 they changed the definitions of land that they report on at the county level. So right after 2014, it actually changes so much that you lose a lot of county level data, which then makes the data after 2014 really not comparable with before 2014. So, and so that's part of the issue with, using that data to go forward. Other data sets are there. In particular, the one that is being used much more is something called the cropland data layer, which is provided by the USDA, which is satellite data. Unfortunately, that data only goes back to 2008 at the national level. And so you miss out on a lot of the period before that, which is when the ramp up in the biofuel production really took place. So so we've actually just finished a study that is looking in particular at soy biodiesel using the CDL data 2008 and onwards, because biodiesel production started more later. So, but then in the case of corn, you have to make that trade-off between whether you want, to use later data and miss out on some things or not. So that's one of the issues. We have done that, but I don't have those results right here ready to show it to you today.
Makes sense. And then, so for the crop coverage, the cropland data layer covers a lot of the stuff, but is there fine-grained data sets on bioproduction, like biofuel production across all these sites, or is it just national trends?
With the CDL, the cropland data layer just tells you where the crops are which crops are being grown and where, and
But you don't know why. So are there local
No.
data sets on what are the crops used for?
No, that's that's not available, and that part of the reason is because these crops are not only being sold to a refinery. There's no information on where these crops are going. They get sold to an elevator, and the ethanol refinery buys it from the elevator, and so it's something, that's the thing. If we had that information, it'd be a lot easier, but we have to use these statistical methods to glean that information indirectly.
Okay, thank you.
And so so that's the limitation of this reduced form approach. I mean, I think you already hit upon some of that, which is that all we can tell from here is what are the signs of the coefficients? Are they in the right direction? What is the magnitude? But it's really hard to understand why, and and also recognizing that biofuel, when you use corn for ethanol, 1/3 of that, the left, the after the process, after it's converted, goes back as something called DDGS, or distillers dried soluble grains, that go back to the feed as feed to the livestock, and offset the need for some corn and soy meal. And so so it's also not a one-to-one relationship. Even just knowing that this corn was used doesn't mean that all of the corn was used for biofuel, and some of it is going back into the feed markets. And so in order to really understand that, and also to understand what's causing these land use changes to differ so much over time, and is it changes in the productivity of the land, and is it changes in the which land is being converted? Is it marginal land? Is it native grasslands? Is it land from other crops? All of that information is not, you can't get that kind of information from the reduced form approach. So we do the simulation model, same period, so 2007 to 2018. And particularly, we also wanted to answer this question of like, to what extent did the 10 million acre reduction in the CRP, was it due to biofuels? And also separate out corn ethanol from soy biodiesel and so on. And then look at the uncertainties, because this is not a precise science, and we're trying to understand there are so many uncertainties about crop yields, land availability in our basic data that affect our outcomes. So how much would these outcomes be affected because of that uncertainty? And then lastly, what does this mean for the carbon intensity of biofuels, which is really what we were originally after. So we use this model. It's called the Biofuel Environmental Policy Analysis Model. It's a multi-sector model, in particular focusing here on the agriculture sector and the transportation sector. Has a lot of details built in with all of the connections between, the demand for multiple crops, the supply, the costs, and exports and imports of oil, and all of the details that go in. And we run it recursively over time, so we run this up to 2018 in this case, and we can also use this to go beyond that and to say, well, what would happen beyond 2023 and in the future and so on. So we've done papers looking at those factors as well, and also beyond the current generation of biofuels, looking at all of the issues that were raised today about what if we produced it out of corn residues, and what if we grew perennial grasses, what if we use forest residues, how would that be better or not, and so on. In the interest of time, I want to just show you results from these three scenarios, again, with the intent of doing, no biofuels, only a corn ethanol mandate, which is 15 billion gallons, or having both corn ethanol and a biodiesel mandate, and separating out all of these effects. And so this red line here shows the reduction in the CRP acres, and just focusing on one outcome, declining from about 35 to about 23, 24 million acres or so by 2018. And the blue line shows the prediction from the model that with the current scenario of the biofuels that we're producing, this is what the model predicts, that CRP would go down. And so it's, again, a pretty close prediction.
So a question in the model, is it calibrated based on the prior trends in the economy? Is that the approach?
Yeah, so this is exactly how it's valid. It's calibrated based on data about, it has demand curves, supply curves that are all calibrated based on observed data over the it's calibrated. This version of the model is calibrated to 2007, and based on the previous 3 years of data on yields and demand and all of that. And then the model is validated, which means that we run the model with all of its parameters and data, and we look at the observed outcomes from the model, and we compare it to the we look at the simulated outcomes from the model and compare it to the observed data in real life. And this is one outcome that we can see, but we also look at other things. How does the model predict prices, land under particular crops, and other, a list of many variables that we compare in order to make sure that the model is reflecting reality as well as it possibly can.
Okay, that makes sense. And now, so one thing I'm a little shocked how how accurate this plot is, because such models, obviously this is it sounds like a dynamic general equilibrium model, right? It's that family.
It's a partial equilibrium model, yes.
Yeah, so they're they're obviously missing stuff, because we just talked about all the data you don't have available to you. So what's your success in reproducing the more challenging dynamics of reality?
I think it's model development and is as much an art as a science.
Yes.
And it is, sort of trying to capture as much as possible of the reality in terms of, but there's obviously limitations. But I think it's, I think it just reflects the fact that we were able to capture most of the important elements that affect decisions. And yeah.
And then maybe looking into the future, if we were to start connecting this up into let me think any integrated assessment model for, let's say, climate change interacting with the agricultural economy. I guess what would, where would it shine, and what do you think would fall apart in terms of we just don't have enough data or dynamics from our past history?
So I think the one of the challenges becomes of trying to go far out into the future with these models. So in this one, we're trying to replicate observed reality, for which we have data, and but then when we, in the other papers that I work on, we are actually trying to look at land use change with scenarios for biofuel production and so on, going out to 2030, 2040, and so on. And looking at crops that don't even exist right now, such as miscanthus and switchgrass and so on, and that could be grown on land that is not currently cropland, and it could be grown on marginal land, and a lot of uncertainty about where the marginal land is and how much is it, which land is convertible. And then there is all the other pasture land, permanent pasture land, and so on, that could also be converted if the incentives are right. So that's where uncertainties increase, and then you can, in a recent paper, we've done sort of Monte Carlo estimation and said, okay, you have all of this distribution, and how large is that space of uncertainty? So then you have to start doing scenarios or Monte Carlo estimates and looking at ranges of uncertainty and see where we have more agreement than others. But it, and that's what the climate models do as well. I mean,
Right.
So that this would be similar in its challenges of going forward.
Well, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. And so this just shows how, we look at, this one shows that the extent to which, if we had just kept the 2005 level of biofuels, that constant at that level, then this is the gray line that shows us the decline in CRP. And this is for all the other reasons, such as the Farm Bill and everything else. The yellow shows how much was because of corn ethanol. So you can see the deviation, which is shown at the bottom, is how many acres was due to due to ethanol. And it's a portion of it. I mean, it's maybe about 45% or something is due to ethanol, and the rest is for other reasons. Similarly, here this shows because of biodiesel. It's this additional darker line here beyond corn ethanol. So you can separate these things out and really isolate the effects because of particular factors. And here we kind of calculated the land use intensity, similar to what I'd shown you earlier. And you can see that we did two scenarios, which is just what I was just describing, is assuming which type of land is going to convert. Is it only going to be the marginal idle cropland that is there and easy to convert, or could farmers go out and convert real non-cropland? And we don't know. We can put some parameters in the model on the cost of conversion, and so, but those are very those are not based on a lot of hard data because it's not available. So we can see that there is a significant divergence in the orange line, which assumes that farmers can go out and convert some pasture land and permanent grasslands, versus if you don't. It ranges from about 0.4 to 0.6, which is similar in range to what I showed you from our empirical model. And this here on the right, this shows the if you take the entire literature, I mean, this is based on another study, a review study somebody did. They put all of the data from numerous studies and came up with a median value of about 0.5, and for the grams, the million acres of cropland needed per billion gallons. And so our study is sort of in the same ballpark, but if you assume that other land could convert, then the numbers are higher. For biodiesel, the numbers are higher than for corn ethanol, and that's because biodiesel is based on soybeans, which has low yields, much lower yields than corn, so you need a lot more land to produce the biofuels. And so, and again, significant divergence depending on what assumptions are made about which type of land is going to convert. this is sort of the uncertainty analysis where we allowed a number of different factors to randomly change, and we did a Monte Carlo and looked at. So just to explain this, on the y-axis is this is in different units, but now it's in hectares per billion liters. Sorry for changing units here. And then here on the x-axis, it shows the carbon intensity because of the land use change. So we looked at which land was converted, how much carbon was in that land, and when it's converted, what is the emissions associated with that conversion on a per megajoule basis. And so, converting it to units that we were just talking about, we find that this ranges all the way from 0.5 to 1.5 million acres per billion gallons, with a median value of 0.7. So on my previous slide, it said that depending on what we are assuming, it could be 0.4 to 0.5 on the dark line, and 0.7 to 0.75 on the orange line. And when we do this, as a Monte Carlo, we find that it's the median value is 0.7, but the range is 0.5 to 1.5, depending on how crop yields change because of weather, land availability changes, and so on.
So just for scale, what's the current acreage of corn in U.S.?
It's about 90 million acres.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. So what does this mean in terms of carbon intensity? We find that the median value, again, it ranges from 10 to 31 grams of CO2 per megajoule, the median value of about 15. For reference, the grams of CO2 per megajoule of gasoline is 94, and the carbon intensity of producing corn ethanol beyond the land, once you take the corn, you take it to the refinery, and then you have to convert it and all of that. That is also carbon intensive because it requires energy to do that. And it's typically fossil energy that is being used to convert the corn to ethanol. If you add up all of that, and there's also fossil fuel energy going in and producing the corn. You have to put fertilizer, you need the tractors, and you have to transport it and all of that. So if you add up all of those emissions along the life cycle of producing the corn from the field and taking it to the refinery and converting it, that's about 45. So the total carbon intensity would be 45 plus 15, which is about 60 grams of CO2 per megajoule. If you compare that to the 94 grams of CO2 per megajoule for gasoline, you can see what the savings are. So based on this analysis, we would say corn ethanol is still saving, reducing emissions compared to gasoline. And despite the land use change, it still has some carbon mitigation benefits. So just to conclude, we do find that the promise of biofuels is that they're renewable and they're lower carbon, and can be a way to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. But we worry about the unintended impacts that they have on land use and on the agricultural sector, and emissions that they can cause indirectly. And so and that is why we need economic models in order to be able to isolate the effect on these unintended effects. And what I presented here were two different approaches to do that, both empirical, that is historical data-based, simulation-based. And it was a great comfort to us to find that there was remarkable convergence, even though these models are based on quite different methods, underlying assumptions, and so on. And if we evaluate the uncertainty, we find it reduces emissions by about 20 to 40% or so relative to gasoline. So let me stop with that, and hopefully have time for a couple of questions.
Well, thank you very much. This is fascinating. Well, one question is for me. I'm thinking if you're planning agricultural policy, or really just starting a biofuels business, the obvious use of this kind of model, and it's just you say, where would I put my biorefinery? Do I target wild grasses and go there? And presumably the area is much larger, the transportation cost, transportation emissions, versus in the middle of cornfields or forests where everything is near me. I guess to what extent is it usable, or what gaps remain?
Um, yeah, I think, again, that is something that people have done, which is to look at what would be the optimal places to place these refineries, taking into account the amount of feedstock that's available and transportation costs of that feedstock, as well as, and related to that is the size of the refinery, because the bigger the refinery, the bigger the fuel shed where you have to get the feedstock. And the issue with going towards new crops and wild grasses or energy crops that we are, and cellulosic biofuels in general, is that we have to solve another problem. And, there's a little bit more complexity, because now we have to see, which feedstock is the preferable feedstock in which location. So when you're thinking about biorefinery location, it's no longer just corn for ethanol. It could be wild grasses, it could be short rotation woody crops, it could be perennial grasses and forest residues, crop residues. So there's a multiple set of options, and we have to solve a joint problem of which is the preferred option, because that then impacts the yield of that, the cost of that differs. And is the biorefinery going to be a single feedstock refinery, or is it going to be able to use multiple feedstocks? Most of the current work suggests that these refineries are going to have to be tailored, at least initially, to particular feedstock attributes. So again, we do it. It's subject to the usual set of uncertainties about assumptions that have to be made when dealing with things that we're not currently growing. But there is enough information that allows us to make reasonable assumptions in order to be able to come up with some broad-based answers.
Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense. And then, we have, just expanding more broadly, we talk about biofuels, but there's also what forest can be used for mass timber construction. A lot of the agricultural waste can be used also for bioplastics. Hydrogen production uses some of the same thing. Methanol, that's a more common fuel for cargo ships. So how big is this value chain that we're really talking about with the trade-offs we have to be making?
Yeah, I think the methods, I guess the methods and the models to do that, the methods exist. I think the key challenge with expanding this is that as we go into areas where we have at the core of this is an economic model that relies on a lot of data from other disciplines, which we didn't get into here. But I work with modelers that are looking at yields of these crops and of new crops that are not yet grown. Those that are actually trying to quantify how much land is there and what is marginal, what is not, and sorting that out, as well as with engineering researchers who are modeling refinery scale models that are looking at what the costs are, what are the greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. So as we go into more like hydrogen production and methanol and other things, the data availability starts to really become a bigger challenge. So you have to scramble for doing that. One of the advantages that I'm fortunate to have here is that we've had a dedicated program at the University of Illinois going back to 2007, where we've had a center level grants. So I, as an economist, am funded along with the natural scientists and the engineers and the biochemists, and they're all working on this and different aspects of it, and then we can pull all of that information together to develop these models that can provide these sort of detailed answers. But very often that's not the case, and then you have people that are you have to go look at the literature and try to get this information. It's not the most suitable for the one that you're looking at, but you have to try to fill put a square thing into a round hole kind of
Right.
situation. So.
I got it. Well, yeah, thank you very much. It was fascinating, really valuable.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you
All
very
right.
much. And
Yeah.
have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.